Test 1, 2. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Check. Check.
Looks good.
1, 2, 1, 2. So your level's good.
Yeah, you go.
Mute is not.
Yeah,
1,
no.
2.
No, you can go.
6.
Okay.
1, 2. So, right now,
Yes. You can use Auraria. So he has all the plan like we discussed by email.
I'm sorry?
He has the thing with questions on the
All right, cool.
I brought just three topics, and then I'm hoping they'll ask a bunch of questions.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So you have questions for yourself?
I have 3 questions myself that we can bring up, and then hopefully bring up.
Okay. Well, you have John.
The bank guys? Before the bank? To say what I have to say.
And I have like a.
I don't take whole like an extra credit point.
How do you think? It's a long miss of food. I mean, who has this room have an access? Who can? I mean, where I want to be on stage.
Now we lost one. Too many people is like cannot take it.
Yeah. Oh, hello.
Nowrasteh.
Yes.
Here's Mark.
Hey, how are you, Joe? Good to see you.
Likewise.
That 9 is just so loud.
Oh, I know. It's everywhere. If I take it off, there's holes. It's so old school.
Made a
Well,
lunge at the audience.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon.
They're right there.
My name is Alex Padilla. I'm the director of Exploring Economic Freedom. I'm also an associate professor of economics at Metro States. Today we are very fortunate to have 2 experts, Mark Krikorian from the Center for Immigration Studies and Alex Nowrasteh from the Cato Institute to debate a major public policy issue: what should the U.S. immigration policy be? Allow me to give you a brief introduction to the Exploring Economic Freedom Project and to thank our sponsors. The Exploring Economic Freedom Project was founded in 2007, and its main objective is to serve as an academic forum to explore and to debate the best means to achieve a broader goal of helping improve people's well-being, and more particularly the least well-off. The Exploring Economic Freedom Project organizes lectures and debates on issues related to this broader goal to discover best means to help people live better life. Now, I would like to thank our generous sponsors, Charles Koch Charitable Foundation, the Templeton Foundation, and the Institute for Human Studies. Without these donors, we also believe that ideas matters, and debating ideas are the main driver behind social and political change. This project will not be able to host such events. I would like to introduce you to our moderators for the debate today with Jonathan Gonzalez. Jonathan Gonzalez joined 9 News a little bit more than a year ago as a general assignment reporter. Before that, he was an investigative reporter in Bakersfield, California, where he won multiple awards for his coverage on immigration and its impact on agriculture. In his short time in Denver, Jonathan has covered issues important to the Latino community, one of them being immigration. Jonathan is going to introduce us to our speakers. I hope you enjoy the debate. Thank you. Welcome, Jonathan Gonzalez.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Everybody getting their extra credit in? I know how crucial that is. So I want to thank everyone for being here and for coming to this today. And I want to thank our YouTube viewers, because we're live streaming online. Like you said, my name is Jonathan Gonzalez, and immigration is something that is close to me. Both my parents are immigrants from Costa Rica, as well as many of my extended family members. So I want to thank Metro State for hosting such an important debate and discussion, and for allowing me to moderate it today. As we head towards the 2016 presidential election, immigration continues to be a hot topic among both the left and the right, with even spirited debates. We're finding that even within parties, and much of the debate centers around what should or should not be done with millions of people who live in this country illegally, as well as millions more who are looking to one day call America home. That's where our experts today come in to weigh in on this ongoing discussion. Mark Krikorian is the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies. The center is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit and nonpartisan think tank that calls for less immigration, because their research has found that high levels of immigration have made it more difficult to achieve important national goals, such as better public schools, a cleaner environment, homeland security, and a living wage for native-born and immigrant workers. On the other side of the debate is Alex Nowrasteh with the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank that is also based in D.C. Alex is an immigration policy analyst who argues that an open immigration policy is not only in line with America's values, but that immigration is also crucial to the economic success of the United States. And together, these two co-wrote a book in 2014 called Open Immigration, Yay or Nay, debating their positions. So thank you to Mark and Alex for taking the time to be here with us today. Our debate format will go something like this. It'll be pretty casual and easy. The two will begin with opening statements of no more than 5 minutes, I hope, to introduce themselves and their positions. We will then get to our questions. The person who is asked the question will get 5 minutes to answer. The other will get 5 minutes to respond. At that point, the person who was asked the initial question will get the opportunity for a quick rebuttal. We will do this for several questions, and eventually we want to open the floor up to you guys, because this is your school, this is your topic, and we want your voices to be heard the most, at least I do. After that, we will ask Mark and Alex to give, hopefully short, closing statements. Mark, I will actually start with you, with your opening statement.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let me just start with a show of hands. Who here thinks our government should try to keep terrorists out of the United States? You can raise your hands. It's okay. Don't be afraid. Okay. Who here thinks the government has a responsibility to try to keep violent criminals out of the United States, foreigners or from abroad? Okay. Congratulations. You're all immigration restrictionists. The question is, how should we restrict immigration? What criteria, what standards, what numbers, so on? And there's two ways to think about limiting immigration. And Alex and I think, represent those two models. The first is, and this is Alex's take on the issue, I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth, is that everybody can come except those whom we specifically keep out. In other words, the default setting is everybody gets to come, but we would be able to say everybody except X, Y, and Z. My model, my approach to this is the opposite. Nobody from abroad has any right to come here. Nobody gets to come except those whom we specifically permit to come. So one is everybody can come except, the other is nobody can come except. Now those two approaches could still lead to the same policy, theoretically, where there's lots of exceptions, on both sides. But practically speaking, the first approach, where everyone has a basic right to come except those that we decide to keep out, leads to a much higher level of immigration than my approach, which is that nobody has a right to come here from abroad except those whom we specifically permit. For the first 100 years of our history, we basically followed that first model. Everybody got to come except the people that we specifically excluded. And those exclusions started at the very beginning. In 1645, Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law saying that people who were likely to become charity cases and live off the public dole were not allowed to enter the colony. And there were other exceptions added, convicts over the years, convicts, contract laborers, prostitutes, anarchists, illiterates, people with various diseases, even, and this is one of the stupider limits, but the concept is still the same here, even there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which said Chinese weren't allowed to come. But it's the same concept. Everybody was allowed to come except X, Y, and Z. The thing is, that was unsustainable as communications and transportation technology made it more possible for more and more people to come. Basically, the universe of people that could practically come here got bigger and bigger because of advances in transportation and communications. The old idea that anybody could come except those we keep out was premised kind of on an unspoken idea that natural reality, the oceans and distance and cost, would limit the number of people who came anyway as a practical matter. With telegraphs, with telephone, with steamships, with all the rest of it, that assumption became unsustainable. And we switched, and over the past 100 years, have adopted the other model, where nobody gets to come except those whom we specifically admit and allow in. And this was inevitable. It was going to happen. The old approach was kind of living in a fantasy world where reality, where physical reality created this idea that we could let in anybody who wanted to come. And that just doesn't work anymore. And my basic approach to this, which I'm not going to go into in any depth, but you're free to read it on Amazon. My book is in the digital remainder bin. You can get it for a penny. Is that mass immigration and modern society are incompatible. That the goals and characteristics of a modern society simply don't work with high sustained levels of mass immigration for a variety of economic reasons, public services, assimilation, security, etc. I'm not going to go into detail. How much time do I have, Jonathan? 30 seconds. Okay, well, I'll take my 30. It'll be a long 30 seconds. In economics, we have a post-industrial, knowledge-based economy, not the old economy that depended on muscle power. As far as public services go, in the past, there was no welfare state. There really wasn't much government at all. Now we have a very large government sector, not just welfare, but public schools, healthcare, all kinds of things, in which importing large numbers of poor people results in enormous costs that simply were not generated a century ago when the same kinds of people immigrated. What it basically boils down to is that the immigrants today really aren't that different from the past, from my grandparents and maybe yours or your great-grandparents. What's different is us. Our society has changed in good and bad ways, but all of those ways conspire to make mass immigration fundamentally incompatible with the kind of modern society we aspire to.
Thank you, Mark. Alex? Well, thank you very much for being here today. And I do recommend you buy Mark's book. It is worth every penny.
Thank you.
So please go on Amazon and buy it after or right now with your smartphone. Now, I think Mark is right about summarizing our different views. His view, I think, is that every immigrant is guilty until they prove their innocence. My view is that every immigrant is innocent until the government proves they're guilty, and it has to be a good reason for them to exclude these people. Now, the reasons are obvious, crime, national security, health. There might be some other justifications that we can go into, but the reasons have to be pretty good. And I think the reasons have to be pretty good for several reasons. One, the consequences of immigration to the United States are positive for Americans today. They're obviously positive for the immigrants. They're positive for people in other countries, but primarily the thing that we most care about is that they're positive for the people here today for numerous reasons. The other one is our traditions in this country of being open to foreigners around the world. Those traditions didn't change just because the telegraph or steamship were invented. They didn't change for any other technological reason, so I don't see why we need to thus change our immigration policy to be in line with that. And then the other one is for principles of ethics that I think are pretty obvious to all of us. So on the issues of economics and consequences, economists are not very divided on the impact of immigration on the economy in the United States. The most pessimistic findings you will find is that a 10% increase in the population due to immigration decreases wages for some Americans by about 2%. Now that is not very much. A lot of other work finds that there's almost no change in wages, or wages for Americans go up. Now that might seem weird to all of you. You have a big increase in the supply of workers. Why wouldn't wages fall? Well, the obvious reason is because immigrants are people, and they buy things, and that buying of things increases demand, which increases the demand for jobs in the economy. So if we have to accept the notion that immigrants lower economic output or productivity or wages for Americans in the long run, we have to accept the premise that the world is a fixed economic pie. That if you win or get a job, that means that you took it away from somebody else. And we just know that is not true. And the obvious evidence of that is, if that were true, we would be poorer today than cavemen. Because there are many, many billions of people alive today living higher quality lives with more wealth and more opportunity than ever before, even in this country. So the notion that there's a fixed pie determined by the number of people we hear isn't true, and we can go into the details about the economics if you want to later. Principles, American principles, I think are pretty obvious. About the point about assimilation, there was a huge study that came forward today that one of the questions is, are immigrants and their descendants becoming American as much as previous waves were? About the Italians and the Germans and, the Irish and these sort of groups. It's said today that people today just aren't assimilating. Immigrants aren't assimilating. Well, compared to previous waves, they're assimilating today at the same rate as previous groups in terms of learning English, in terms of family size, in terms of assimilation, when you properly account for it in terms of wages and other issues. So the trend, if we think that the Irish and the Italians and previous groups assimilated fine, then I think that we have to assume today, taking a look at the evidence, that current immigrants and their descendants are assimilating fine as well. You see a lot of upward mobility in the United States. So we don't really see a good reason to restrict immigration on those grounds. In terms of American principles of sort of liberty and open immigration, yeah, there were some really small restrictions in the colonies that were almost never enforced. But for the large part, between the founding of this country and the Constitution and about 1875, there were almost no federal restrictions on immigration. They had to count people when they came in. States had a few rules here and there, but those were mostly struck down by the Supreme Court. And you saw a vast wave of people who came here, their descendants assimilated, they assimilated fine. Now we saw various restrictions build up, a lot of times based on issues of race or eugenics, also based on ideas of subsidizing labor unions who didn't want poor workers to compete with them, other sort of nationalist reasons that are silly when you look back at them at this time period. But you see a lot of really bad reasons for restricting immigration in the past that didn't wash with our traditions as a free country or our traditions of assimilating people who came to the United States. In short, there's really not a good reason to restrict immigration, either economics. There's no good economic reason. There's no reason in terms of lack of assimilation. There's no good reason in terms of crime or national security issues to restrict peaceful people who want to come here without a criminal background. In fact, if you want to accept the notion that restricting immigration is good for the economy or good for our society, then I think you also have to accept the notion that a shrinking population is also good, and I think we know instinctually that that's just not true.
Thank you, Alex. We will begin with our first question. There's that microphone. Everybody get their extra credit signed in? Yeah? All right. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, otherwise known as DACA, gave hundreds of thousands of qualifying immigrants in the country illegally temporary deportation relief as well as a 2-year work permit. Mark, this question is for you. The argument from the Obama administration was that many of these young adults should continue living in a country that has been more of a home to them than wherever they were born. The question is DACA a viable program? And if not, aside from some sort of comprehensive immigration reform, should there be some type of program to allow these immigrants some kind of long-term deportation relief and work authorization?
The president and the supporters of the DREAM Act, which is what DACA is the sort of unilateral administrative version of, have a good argument. For years, I've argued that there is a strong case to make for people who really did come here in infancy or as toddlers and whose worldview and psychology and emotional identity is formed in the United States. Now, the legislation, whether it's the DREAM Act, which was repeatedly voted down by Congress, or DACA, which the president just had said he had no authority to do and then did anyway for political reasons. That expands much beyond. I mean, it includes people who came here as teenagers, and I have teenagers, and their their identity is already formed. They're not coming as toddlers or infants. But for people who actually came at very young ages, I think there's a good case to make for amnestying those kids. There's two problems, though. The first is a kind of smaller, I guess one of terminology is, if we're going to do it, let's just call it what it is. It's an amnesty. Illegal immigrants get to stay. That's an amnesty. There's reasons for that. Sometimes that's justified. The other point, though, and this is, I think, the key point that goes beyond the immigration debate itself, is that the president has no authority to do this. This is a constitutional issue. And the arguments the president was making are ones he should be making to lawmakers, and that lawmakers should be making to each other. And what the president said is that this is such an emergency, that this is literally he didn't use the word emergency, but this is what he means, that it was a national emergency that warranted direct action by the executive, comparable to a military situation where Congress didn't have the chance to respond and the president had to act. It was not that kind of emergency. Congress specifically refused to enact DACA, the DREAM Act, and so he just doesn't have the right to do it. Now, part of the reason this happened is because the supporters of the DREAM Act were overreaching. Rather than making a more modest case, rather than saying, okay, let's trade amnesty for these kids, adults mostly actually, almost all of them, in exchange for something that, say, the immigration hawks would like to see, like mandatory use of E-Verify, some kind of small package. That actually could have passed. Instead, they wanted everything, and they got nothing, and so the president said he was just going to do it on his own.
It's a good policy, and I wish it went further, and I wish it extended to all unlawful immigrants who weren't violent or property offenders. I think they should be able to stay, get a green card, work, and eventually naturalize. The question is, of course, in the court case, is not whether it's good policy or not. The question is whether it's constitutional. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not going to pretend to be one. The news is full of people who pretend to be it whenever these cases come out. There may be a good reason why this is unconstitutional. There are arguments on both sides. So I'll leave the experts to talk about those issues. But in terms of the pure policy, in terms of the effect on the U.S. economy and the effect of these kids who are brought here, and even if they were teenagers, I don't really care about that. Even if they were teenagers when they're brought here, the policy effect on them is very, very positive.
Mark, any response?
Well, it's sort of a cop-out to say, well, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I'm not going to have an opinion. As a citizen, it's your responsibility to have an opinion about what the Constitution says and doesn't say. And it's really not very ambiguous here. The president claims to have the right to give work permits and Social Security numbers to anybody he wants, whether the people's elected representatives in Congress like it or not, unless they specifically say that this person you cannot give a work permit to this person. That is an arrogation of power that is unprecedented and is part of a larger approach to governance from this administration that goes beyond immigration, that is simply incompatible with a republic with separation of powers. It's really more, not to use derogatory analogies, let me just say it's more like a Gaullist version of governance, where the president of France essentially rules and the legislature is kind of there to give him advice and maybe cause him trouble once in a while, but is a secondary branch. In our system of government, there's a reason Congress is in Article 1 of the Constitution, because because the Congress decides what the law is. Congress says jump, the president asks how high. And our president's approach is he's the one who says jump, and Congress is the one who says how high.
I'd like to say one quick thing. Cato, my organization, is probably the only group that filed a brief saying that the president's actions are unconstitutional, but that DACA and DAPA were excellent policies. Yeah. That's because we have principles at Cato about looking at the Constitution and trying to view it. I doubt very much that the other side, almost everybody else who has an opinion about this topic is based on their opinion about immigration. At Cato, it's what is the topic about the Constitution, but I don't work on the Constitution, and I think it's your duty as a citizen, if you don't know about a topic, to either learn about it or to be agnostic about it, not to spout off just because you're a citizen about something you don't know about.
Thank you, Alex. Question 2 will go to you, Alex. The Pew Research Center says there are a record 45 million immigrants living in the United States today, and it predicts that if immigration, both legal and illegal, continues at its current pace, in 50 years, the total population of this country will grow by nearly 35% of what it is today, as opposed to just 4% population increase if immigration somehow stopped altogether. Obviously hard to look that far into the future, but many would argue our country, our economy, our schools could never handle a 35% population boom by 2065, especially when a huge part of that growth would come from immigration. What are your thoughts on that?
Part of that assumption is that people are just consumers and not producers. What we see in terms of the public fisc and the public fiscal effects, and I just wrote a book chapter on this that came out in the Economics of Immigration at Texas Tech University, taking a look at the fiscal effects. Immigrants about pay their way in almost every circumstance for the public goods and benefits that they consume over the long run. So the notion that because we have more people, we won't be able to pay for that, I think is just ludicrous. Now, if you have a problem with welfare, you have a problem with public benefits, you can reform those programs. We've done it in the past. We'll do it before. We do it again. Immigrants already are barred from many means-tested public welfare benefits in the United States. But I want to lay out an alternative scenario. As historian Hirschman wrote a great paper in the Journal of Demography about 10 years ago. And he asked the question, what if the United States stopped all immigration in the year 1800? What would be the U.S. population in the year 2005? Now, the U.S. population in 2005 was about 310 million people, give or take a little bit. He estimated that the population would be a mere 97 million. Now, does anybody think, in the long run, in the long term, having more than 200 fewer Americans is better for us? I mean, how many of you have an ancestor who came after the year 1800? How many of you? Do you think this would be a better country if you weren't here today? A wealthier country? Okay, well, let's ask this question in 100 years. Let's say we follow Mark's policy and we substantially curtail legal immigration. That means tens of millions, hundreds of millions of fewer people will be Americans in the future. Do you think that that will make for a better, wealthier, more successful, more powerful country in the world sphere than it is today? Does anybody seriously believe that when you take it out to the long term? Maybe I'm an optimist, but I do think that America's best days are ahead of it. Its most prosperous days are ahead of it. A day when there's more freedom and equality for everybody going forward ahead of it. And frankly, the notion that having fewer of us going forward is better for all those goals, I think, is ludicrous.
Mark, could an immigration boom by 35% by in 50 years, could our country sustain that?
There's a couple issues. First is that libertarianism really is sort of a sophomore dorm room ideology in a lot of ways. And I mean that in the best possible way. Because it doesn't take into account issues of prudence and practicality. And whatever you think about immigration, it is imprudent to be so rapidly growing our population through government policy. Because what we're talking about here is the size of the federal immigration program. It's a government program, just like farm subsidies, just like the Veterans Administration. And even if it's a good idea to massively increase our population for purposes of increasing national power, which strikes me as kind of an odd goal, the speed, the rate of increase that we're talking about here is, in my opinion, imprudent. That's number one. Number two, I have no views. I am actually agnostic about what the population of the United States should be 100 years from now. I don't think it's any of the government's business to do that kind of central planning and social engineering. I think American moms and dads should be the ones who mainly decide how many Americans there are going to be in the future. What today's immigration policy, not even the increases that Senator Rubio and President Obama were pushing a couple of years ago, today's immigration policy will mean that the overwhelming majority of future population growth will come from the federal immigration program rather than from American moms and dads. And that just strikes me as contrary to the very concept of self-government. It is social engineering by the state, where the leaders of the state have decided that Americans are somehow defective and not having enough kids, and therefore others have to be imported to fix our mistakes. And this isn't just an American perspective. Europe's elites have the same view. Japan's elites have the same view. They've been less successful at imposing it on their populations. But this elite perspective that the citizenry of modern developed countries are broken and defective and need to be supplemented and improved by newcomers from abroad strikes me as abhorrent.
The social engineering aspect of this is the person who wants big government policy to stop something that would happen in the absence of that policy. Now, I don't want the government to select people or subsidize it. I just want them to get out of the way. Now, if they get out of the way, that's not social engineering. What is social engineering is blocking almost everybody who wants to come here because you have a particular vision. Now, I don't know what the vision for the future is, but I do know that it's better to produce that vision. The vision always works out better when the government has less of a role in it in the future, especially in planning the population. And one of the primary arguments used 100 years ago and before that to wall off immigration for the first time from Europe and other places was social engineering, based on widely discredited beliefs that Mark doesn't believe in, things like eugenics and race theory and trying to help the working class through all this other stuff. That's the basis of social engineering. Now, whatever reason why you don't want to do it today, it's the big government immigration restrictions that do the social engineering, not the free market policy.
Any response?
I don't know. We disagree, so that's...
Yeah, that's usually how it goes. Mark, this last question of mine goes to you. There are many economists, like Alex said, that say an open immigration policy does have only a positive effect on our GDP to the tune of billions, maybe trillions a year, while some argue that closing off our borders actually would also have a negative effect. What has your research found in terms of immigration on GDP and economics, and do you believe less immigration could actually hurt our economy or help?
There's no question that immigration creates a small net gain for GDP. First of all, it creates a bigger GDP. There's no question about that. I mean, there's more people, the economy's bigger. If everybody from Bangladesh moved here, the economy would be bigger. There's no question about it. The question, though, is what is the net benefit? In other words, every government policy, every federal program, including immigration, creates winners and losers. Creates benefits for some people, costs for others. President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors during the last big immigration debate back in 2007 actually estimated the net gain to the economy from immigration at that point. The GDP was somewhat smaller, and so the number would be smaller, but the number at the time was $37 billion a year. Sounds like a lot. The problem, of course, is that there's two problems. One is, it's minuscule. This is a drop in the bucket. At the time, it was 28/100% of the GDP. So the net benefit created by immigration exists, but it's very small. And the other fundamental point is that it comes as a result of impoverishing the poor and spreading that benefit of very slightly lower prices across the rest of the population. Roughly speaking, 10% of Americans would lose, or 10% of the people who live here would lose, Americans, but also even more earlier immigrants. And the 90% of us would enjoy a very small benefit. So the question here, strictly in economic terms, not as far as public services go, because the entire economic benefit is wiped out by increased public service use. But looking just at the economic benefit, the question here is it just? Is a federal policy morally defensible when it creates an economic benefit by impoverishing the poor for the benefit of everybody else? This is a moral question, and you could answer it either way, because after all, 9 people benefit, 1 loses. My concern is that the one who loses is the least who can afford it. The one who loses, whose wages are decreased, are the ones who already can barely make it on what they have now. So I answer, yes, there's a small economic benefit, but it is wrong to base an immigration policy on such a benefit.
Alex?
That small counting of the immigration benefit excludes the benefit to all the immigrants or to all the new Americans who are here today. So that just takes a look at the benefits for the people who are already here before, which is fair enough. I can work with that definition. But what you see is when you take a look at these different research, and you see research by Ottaviano and Perry, by Chad Sparber, by Kevin Shee, huge literature reviews done by people who study this, they find very little wage effects either way. And part of the reason is immigrants buy things and boost demand for jobs. Another one is that immigrants are different than us. They have different skill levels when they come here. So what you see is a lot of these lower-skilled Americans who compete with lower-skilled immigrants, the low-skilled immigrants push them up the wage ladder. It's called occupational upgrading. There's even a term for it in the economics literature. It's so well developed. And you take a look at this when you look at a restaurant. What jobs do the lower-skilled immigrants who are new to this country do in a restaurant? They do jobs that don't require too much communication with the customers. Busboy, dishwasher, things like that. What jobs do the lower-skilled Americans who used to do those jobs do? Waiter, waitress, hostess, higher-paying professions. So what you see is when you dig into the economy, when you take a look at the result of these different firms and these different sectors of the economy and everything else, you see an occupational upgrading and a wage upgrading. So the notion that, it's just fundamentally just the negative wage effects, if and when they do exist, are very, very small, very concentrated, and there are better ways to deal with those, I think, than punishing 90% of Americans who would gain and all of the immigrants who would gain as well, and all of their descendants too.
Mark, any response?
First of all, government policy must be, in a democracy, must be based on what benefits the members of that society, not what benefits people who are abroad who are not members of society. So absolutely immigrants benefit significantly from immigration. In fact, the way to think about it might be, and I'm just making these numbers up, but it gives you an idea. Somebody abroad, say there's a wealth scale of 1 to 10 for the world, the poorest to the richest. Somebody who's an immigrant is a 3. If he comes to the United States, he may go up to a 7. The American who competes with him, and virtually all immigrants compete with Americans. All occupations that immigrants dominate, immigrants are concentrated in, except for a handful, are dominated by the native born. So the immigrant goes, let's say, from a 3 to a 7. But the American, who is already here, say goes from an 8 to a 7. Is that right? Is that the legitimate basis for an immigration policy? Enriching people who do not belong to the society at the price of impoverishing people, the most marginal and poorest people in our society, as a consequence? I'd have to say no. And again, you can take the position that that's a good policy. It's ultimately a moral question, and I think we have a responsibility to not do more damage to our fellow citizens who are struggling already, for whatever reason, for any variety of reasons. Now, this doesn't, I'm not making a specific, proactive recommendation about what other policies, what we should be doing to help the most marginalized in our own country. That's a political decision and a political issue we're going to have a lot of differences about. People have different opinions. But the first rule should be do no harm. And immigration policy, it seems to me, should be based on the principle do no harm to the least among us.
I just want to remind everybody that Mark and I agree the worst possible scenario is that 90% of Americans benefit and 10% lose. And there are other things you can do to help that 10% than to hurt 90% of Americans.
I do have one more question, and this is for Alex. We'll throw it at you, and it's actually for both of you separately. But at the political level, at the legislative level, what kind of policies would you like to see implemented at the federal legislative level, and how would that policy impact immigrants living here in this country today, either illegal or legal?
Well, I think a couple small policies. One, I think that the current unauthorized immigrants who are here, who are not violent or property offenders, should be legalized, should have a path to a green card and a path to citizenship with very few barriers or penalties. And I also think that future immigration should be highly liberalized. We should allow more people to come to this country who are workers, who want to work, who want to contribute, who want to start businesses, the vast majority of which, right now, there is no visa available for these folks. It's not a matter of waiting in line. There is no line. And I think, based on our traditions, based on the evidence we've talked about today, that we should broadly make it easier for people to come here. I think we do enough for enforcement, probably too much for enforcement. And I think if we want immigration enforcement to be more effective, we need to have better rules. We need to make it easier for people to come here legally to shrink the size of the black market. In the same sense of prohibition. We didn't enforce alcohol restrictions to the point where nobody was bootlegging when we decided to re-legalize alcohol. We realized we had made a mistake, and to shrink the black market, we had to make alcohol legal again so that we could actually regulate it. Now, I hate to say that as a libertarian, but you can't regulate a black market. So if the government wants to have some semblance of control and measurement, a lot more immigration needs to be legal, and it doesn't need to go all the way to free immigration or anything like that. It just needs to be more wide, more easy, especially for low-skilled workers to come here. So I would like to see movement along those lines. Middle-skilled, low-skilled, and high-skilled workers determined by the market to come here because the government is very poor at picking winners and losers with everything. So I think that we should let the market decide the types, the quantity, well, maybe not initially the quantity, but eventually the quantity and the skill level of these workers and the wages that they want to work at when they're here.
The difference with prohibition, of course, is there's only so much liquor you can drink. Whereas there is literally no limit. Well, literally as I'm using that in the Joe Biden sense. But there is practically no limit to the number of foreigners who would move here if they could. Europe is already seeing just the very top tip, scraping top edge of the iceberg in what they're experiencing now of what you would have with open immigration. In fact, the proponents of open immigration premise their economic claims on the idea that 5 billion people will move from the third world to the United States, Europe, and Japan. Probably not going to happen, but how many hundreds of millions does it take to fundamentally change the institutions of a society? What I would want to see is in a practical kind of legislative sense. In other words, how do we get out of this political stalemate that we're in? I'm not sure this will work, but my roadmap for it is, one, specific milestones for enforcement. And I mean implementation of enforcement systems like mandatory use of E-Verify, so when you get a job, the employer is filing the paperwork anyway for you with Social Security and IRS, and he just checks to make sure you're telling him the truth. That exists now. Almost half of new hires are already screened through E-Verify. Making that part of the universal part of the hiring process would be one, making it therefore hard for illegals to get jobs. A visa tracking system. Most of today's new illegal immigrants, because each day there's about 1,000 new illegal aliens who settle in the United States. The majority of them come in legally on a student visa, a tourist visa, what have you, and then just never leave. We do not have a checkout system for foreign visitors to make sure that they're not lying to us when they tell us that they're going to leave when they promise to leave. That would be the second thing that seems to me is a prerequisite. And the third point, and this is a concrete measurement to enable us to move to the next step, which I'll get to in a second, is a couple of, maybe say, 2 independent estimates of the size of the illegal population declining, showing that it's declining consistently for three years in a row. In other words, the point is that we have fixed the problem that created this large illegal population. The next step then, from my perspective, is amnestying most of the illegals who are still here in exchange for deep, permanent cuts in future legal immigration. So we achieve a kind of equilibrium that we simply don't have now.
I would just like to say the notion that we can get to where we want with enforcement I don't think is realistic. Historically, the only times when illegal or unlawful immigration has been very close to zero or even net negative for any period of time was during the Great Depression when nobody wanted to come and during World War II. The other times in American history, in the 1920s after they passed these laws, in the late 40s and 50s and onward, the times when we've been able to decrease unlawful immigration is when it's easier to come here lawfully, like during the Bracero program or other issues. It's just, I think, not realistic given the government's incompetence and everything that they're somehow magically going to get their act together with this for some period of time. They're not. We need to have a public policy of immigration that realistically takes account of the government's actual ability to enforce these laws, which is very poor. Very, very poor, and they're not suddenly going to get better. About Europe, very briefly as well, Europe does not have an open immigration policy. It has an open policy if you're European to be able to move to other European countries, but a lot of their policies in Europe right now self-select. They select refugees intentionally, people that are most war-torn, most harmed, most damaged, and in most of these countries, they put them on means-tested welfare benefits, housing benefits immediately, so they don't have to work, and they're segregated in housing projects where they don't have to interact with the locals at all. Now, there are other problems in Europe, but I just don't think it's fair to call Europe's issues right now with immigration a result of an open borders policy.
Let me only say that you can't say that the government is incapable of enforcing immigration laws until you actually try it. And it would be nice if we tried it. And the reason we have weak, almost laughable enforcement is not simply because of government incompetence. Government's a big institution. All big institutions are loaded with incompetence, and the government even more than usual, probably, because there's no profit motive. But there are many things the government does, in fact, do reasonably competently, and you can't really criticize incompetence until you give it a try. Let me just give you one example of something we don't do. This was a news report, investigative report from a couple weeks ago. The IRS gets tax returns and W-2s that have stolen Social Security numbers on them. The IRS policy is that its employees are prohibited on pain of firing from telling the Americans whose numbers were stolen that that's what happened to their numbers. That's not an example of incompetence. That's an example of political manipulation. And the problem with immigration enforcement is not that it's imperfect. It's always going to be imperfect. Life is imperfect. The problem is that corporate interests have always prevented the enforcement of immigration laws through exercise of political power. And in political science, it's what they call client politics. The interests of whether it's farmers or landscapers or ski resort owners or what have you, in having a loose immigration system where the laws aren't enforced is very intense. They'll put a lot of money, a lot of time in twisting the arms of congressmen and pressuring bureaucrats to do their will, whereas the costs are spread over the rest of society, and so there isn't the same intensity of lobbying. And this shows empirically, when you look at the amount of money spent on immigration lobbying, well over 95% of it comes from those attempting to gut immigration laws and enforcement, as opposed to those trying to support the enforcement.
I think Mark just proved
How
my
many back and forth are we going?
Yeah, I was going to say that's 2 each now. But
well, I think people are enjoying this. I think that proves my point. The notion that somehow we'll have perfect immigration policy or really good enforcement, I promise, just as soon as we stop all lobbying, it's pretty Pollyannish, pretty absurd, and pretty silly. I mean, who thinks that we're going to be able to, who thinks that we're going to be able to get that? I mean, the reason why enforcement doesn't work, one big reason, is that a lot of people, if enforcement works well, are going to lose a lot or everything. And they are willing to spend all that they have to prevent it through political manipulation or lobbying or any other legitimate means to be able to do it. Meanwhile, a lot of people, some people could benefit. 10% of the population, let's say, could benefit, but their benefits are very small. It's called concentrated costs and dispersed benefits. The costs of more enforcement are very, very heavy on a small number of people, so they will spend a lot to stop it. The benefits, however, if they even exist, are spread out widely. So given the reality of our political system, unless you want to change it dramatically through some huge constitutional reform, that's not going to change. So we need to have a policy in immigration that takes that into account.
Okay.
So, well, no.
Oh, no.
Yeah, this
All
is
right,
me. I
last
did
one.
Three. So this
Last
can be the
one.
last one.
Sure.
What Alex
If you
is
say so.
saying, what Alex is saying is that lobbyists have to get their way, and we need to just we need to lie back and pretend to enjoy it. The fact is, they don't always get their way. Child labor was well-nigh universal not that long ago. The Senate held hearings, I remembered looking these up, about 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, and the mill owners were saying, my gosh, if you guys limit our access to 12-year-olds working in factories, we're going to go out of business. It's going to be the end of the frickin' world. We did it anyway. Guess what? It became a labor standard. You don't have to have people chasing around, inspecting factories to make sure there's no kids working in them. To make legal status a labor standard is the goal. I'm not saying it's easy. If it were easy, we wouldn't be doing this. I'd be doing something else, probably farming, I think is kind of what I would do if I wanted another job. But it's not easy. But, what Alex wants isn't easy either. He doesn't get what he wants. I don't get what I want. We fight each other all the time. This doesn't mean that, therefore, we give up just because there's somebody resisting. The point is you fight for what you think is right and work through democratic means to try to get it. And I think there's a realistic policy that I could succeed. Otherwise, why would I be doing this?
I'm sorry, my degree is in economic
my
history,
gosh.
so I just need to make one quick thing about the child labor. Actually, most corporate lobbyists were in favor of the child labor restriction, as well as all labor unions back then. The reason why almost all firms that didn't use child labor were in favor of ending it to crush their competitors. So the notion that somehow all these reforms in the past were for the public good and all this other nonsense, it's gibberish. It's a gibberish. It's a silly view of American history that's not backed up by any of the public choice or poli-sci literature that goes on this. It's fundamentally silly and not true. So the notion that we just suddenly pull up our bootstraps and be in the favor of the public interest and talk really nobly is that's going to make all the difference. I hate to say it's never been that way, not even in the past.
If you didn't know any better, you'd think they're running for president. Thank you, Mark and Alex.
Oh, definitely not.
So I'd like to open it up to you guys. I mean, like I said earlier, it's for you. This debate is for you. It's your school. So if anyone has any questions, we have an open mic right here in the middle of the floor. Don't be shy. Come on up and ask them some questions.
Somebody. I mean, geez.
Can I ask questions to both of them?
Yeah. Or if you, yeah.
I'll start with Mark. You said earlier that you want to block people and allow only select few to come in, the opposite of what Alex wants. Well, that opens up a can of worms is who gets to decide? Does the government obviously get to decide? And what is the criteria? So you're opening up, like, this person no, that person yes, this person has a little bit of criminal record. So that's my first question. My second question has to do with the DREAM Act. And so you said it's not an emergency, but I think to a lot of children, when they're getting deported, to them that is an emergency. You said to do no harm. Well, would that, doing that to that child to deport them, isn't that doing harm to them? So that was my next question. And to Alex.
Hold on. Let's let him answer those two first.
First of all, the DREAM Act does not relate to children. It relates to adults who came as children. So it has nothing, I mean, I understand what you're talking about. You're talking about something completely different. The DREAM Act was about amnestying people who came here before age 16 and then met certain other criteria. So it has nothing to do with kids. It has nothing to do with, and they're all adults because they have to have lived here for 5 years beyond that. So my only point here is that this question about children and deporting families and all that is not relevant to the DREAM Act. The second point, though, I think is a bigger thing that because of Jonathan's 5-minute limitation I wasn't able to go into is who does decide, and what are the criteria we should use? In other words, we start from the perspective that nobody has a right to come here, which is the basis of the law now. Even if you're a tourist, you have to prove, or you want to come as a tourist, you have to prove to the American consular officer that you are not going to stay illegally. But the question then is, what are the exceptions? What are the people we do let in? 3 groups, because all immigration flows are made up mainly of three groups of people: family, skills, and humanitarian immigration. Family immigration, I would not leave up to the government. I actually would privatize that. But because family immigration really amounts to individual Americans making decisions that are going to affect everybody else by deciding which relatives to bring, those should be only the closest relationships. So husbands, wives, and little kids of American citizens. And as long as it's legitimate and there's no fraud and all of that kind of stuff. But that amounts to 350, 400,000 people a year. So that's a lot right there. Secondly, skilled immigration. And even now, we always have some sort of yardstick for skilled immigration. I would raise the bar pretty high. Genuine Einsteins who really are the top people in their fields on the planet. It's not that many people like that. And then for humanitarian immigration, I would limit it only to those people who literally have no other option and who cannot be helped where they are. And as a side note to that, it costs 12 times as much to bring a refugee here as it does to provide for him in abroad, specifically with regard to the Middle East. It's probably an even bigger difference in other places. And so every refugee we resettle is a message that the other 11 people who could have been helped with that money are out of luck. So refugee resettlement should be used only as an extreme last resort. And who decides is the elected representatives of the people, through lawmaking, decide who gets to come. And that's the decision for any kind of governmental policy.
Yeah, I have one question for Alex. And it has to do with the black market. For people who've already come here, and you have illegals that don't necessarily want to become citizens, who are in the black market, not just criminals, but people who have found people that they work for, and so they don't want to pay taxes, so they found a little niche. Do you ever deport these people, or what do you do to these people? Do you force them to become citizens?
Well, no. I mean, I think one of the misconceptions about immigration is that there's only two statuses, unlawful immigrant and citizen. There's a wide range of different legal immigration statuses between them. You can be on a different type of permit, or a work permit, or a non-work permit, or a green card, or perhaps you can even create a third type, which is sort of a permanent green card without a path to citizenship. I don't think that's sustainable politically, but you could do that. What's revealing is with the Reagan amnesty in 1986, amnestied around 3 million or so unlawful immigrants, only about half of those fellows who were amnestied actually chose to become a citizen. So you can live on a green card forever as long as you don't commit any kind of crimes or things that exclude you, and you don't have to become a citizen. I've got a good friend who came here when he was 7 from Nicaragua, grew up in Miami. He's, 47 years old. He's not a citizen, and he doesn't really have the desire to ever naturalize. He's happy with his green card. So I wouldn't force anybody to naturalize, but I think that there should be a process for them to do so if they want to.
Stay with the green card, and
that already exists. So that's, they can choose that for themselves.
It's up to you whether you want to go the next step and become a citizen.
No, nobody, you don't ever have to naturalize if you don't want to, if you have a green card. And I think that's fine. I don't think you should have to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question.
So what you just said kind of leads me into my question. Going with the Reagan Act in the 1980s, which allowed about 3 million illegal immigrants amnesty. And what would you want to have happen differently so we wouldn't be hearing about the same topic 30 years from now to make it actually work to where, that's...
So I think the number one thing that they failed to do in that act was to create a lawful mechanism to expand legal immigration for low-skilled workers who would otherwise come unlawfully. Now, there are a handful of small changes in that law that tried to do that, but they had really no effect. So if you widen the gate and allow more people to come in who are low-skilled legally to work, either permanently or temporarily, you siphon them from the legal market into the black market going forward. So I would legalize future flow, and that would decrease the need to do a lot of the enforcement stuff that they tried to do since then. To give you an example about the number of Border Patrol agents since about 1990 is about five times as many. Since 2004, they've been doubled. We've had a lot more border enforcement than we used to along the southwest border. Mark may want to make it more effective somehow or better or do other things, but we have a lot of enforcement. We've tried a lot of things. And I think what really works, given the examples of America's past, is to allow more lawful migration through legal channels so that we can decrease the demand to come unlawfully.
Enforcement does, in fact, work, and I'm glad Alex brought up the Border Patrol, because the fact is crossings across the Mexican border are down. There's still significant illegal immigration, and it's not just because of enforcement. But the illegal immigrants themselves say part of the reason is the enforcement has become more effective along the southwestern border. Now, that's only half the picture, because the other half is something we don't even try to enforce, which is make sure visitors go home when their time is up. But the part where we have invested resources, some of it badly, some of it stupidly, but it hasn't all been wasted, does have an effect. The other side, the flip side, though, is that the Border Patrol is, in fact, double the size that it was about 10 years ago. But it's still smaller than the New York Police Department. That's the entire Border Patrol, not just on the Mexican border, but everywhere. There's Border Patrol in Canada on the border with Alaska and the Yukon. There's Border Patrol in Florida and in Puerto Rico. All of it put together is smaller than the NYPD. I'm not saying maybe that's the right size, but the idea that we've somehow overdone enforcement is simply a mistake. And, you know, this idea that the 1986 Act question really does get kind of at the core of what we're arguing here. Because what Alex is saying is that everybody who wants to come should just be allowed in, and then you won't have any illegal immigration. Well, yeah, exactly. You won't. But there are literally hundreds of millions of people abroad who would move here in a relatively short period of time, and hundreds of millions more beyond them who would come over time. And, you know, I say let's put it to a vote. Do you want another 300 million people from abroad to move here all at once? Yes or no? I'm happy to have a vote on that, a referendum on that. There's a reason we don't ever do that, is because that's the kind of policy elites are happy with, the public hates. Immigration is the public policy area with the biggest gap between elite preferences and public preferences, and it shows up everywhere. Labor unions want more immigration. They are completely part of the Obama Chamber of Commerce, Marco Rubio alliance on this issue. Ordinary members of unions don't. Church hierarchies want more immigration. People in the pews don't. The organizations that pretend to speak for minorities want more immigration. Ordinary people, members of those minorities, don't. So, you know, I say let's put it to a vote.
If it can ever get there.
And then, like, another question I had was, the United States is currently allows more legal immigrants than any other country in the world. So, how much do we need? How many more do we have to allow into the United States to make it so we would be at this equilibrium where it would benefit everybody equally?
Yeah, sure. Just 30 seconds based on the following question as well. The number one predictor of lawful immigration flows is distance to the United States and the relative economic benefits from their country to here. So we see a lot more illegal immigration now from Central America, a lot less from Mexico, even though the economy has improved a lot in Mexico in recent years. That explains a lot of it. In terms of the numbers of people allowed in the U.S. currently, if you look at just the number of people, that's true. It's about 1 million people a year, a little bit more than that in some years, lawful immigrants on a green card. However, that's equal, because the U.S. is a huge country, about 320 million people, it's equal to about 0.3% of our population annually let into the United States. Canada, for instance, allows in 0.8% immigration compared to the size of their population. So they're more, based on that judge, more than twice as open. Australia lets in about 1.2% of their population in terms of immigration, so 4 times as open. Switzerland, about 1.6 times. So, I'm sorry, about 1.6% annually to come in. So they're about, 1.8 times as much. So they're 6 times as much, 6 times as open in terms of immigration in that regard. What I say is, in terms of numbers, any increase in the numbers, you know, even if the government still determines what those numbers are, is a positive step, because it would allow the market to determine better the total number that should come in. I don't think Congress is very good at hardly anything. I don't think it's very, let me just ask you a question. I saw this, there's this great Twitter account called A Crime a Day. And what they do is they tweet a federal crime every day that you never heard of. 21 U.S.C. section 343H. Make it a federal crime to sell pasteurized processed cheese that sticks to the knife when cut. Now, that's a federal crime to do that. There are lots of federal crimes in every single aspect. Federal law is absurd and insane. Do you think that the median voter, even one, knows about this, 2, supports it, 3, any legislators even know about it, etc. So I think instead of letting this really silly agency determine something as important as the number of people who should come here annually, will lead to a really bad outcome. Now, maybe there should be some barriers in some other ways at some times, but I don't think a blind trust in politicians to determine this stuff, based on all of the other silly, absurd, insane laws that are out there that none of us have even heard of or know about, will lead to a good result. I think we need to trust the market more.
A couple of points. First of all, the lobbyists that Alex loves so much are the reason we have a ban on unpasteurized cheese and all the rest of these idiotic bureaucratic rules that clearly should be cleaned out and eliminated. But they're there for a reason. They're there for the same reason that we have a lot of these ridiculous immigration programs that I would like to get rid of. But Alex's answer, the first part of his answer really does get at the point here. His answer, when you asked, we've taken 1 million people a year, which is more legal immigrants for permanent settlement than all other countries of the world combined, not guest workers, the kind of Saudi Arabia thing where they import people and throw them out, but regular immigrants who are going to be part of the society. We take more than all other countries put together. Your answer was, what should it be? His answer was more. That is the one-word policy of my opponents in general, is more. Years ago, I tried to put a booklet. I did put a booklet together. It wasn't as successful as I wanted. I called it Blueprints for an Ideal Legal Immigration Policy. And I said, look, I wanted people across the board to give me 1,500, 2,000 words on what they actually wanted in legal immigration policy at the end of the day. What was the goal, the end point? Not the, which amendment today, but what do they want it to look like? I talked to people at National Council of La Raza, at the National Immigration Forum, all kinds of people. I said, look, I'm not going to edit this. I'm just going to fix typos. If you've got typos, you get to say anything you want, and I will pay to publish it in this thing along with other people's views. None of them would do it. None of the sort of top lobbyist folks would do it because their immigration policy is more, always more.
I think you see a big difference just right there. I think the political process produces a lot of silly and absurd results, so I want to trust it less. Mark agrees that it produces a lot of silly and absurd results, but he wants to trust it more. Which one makes sense?
Man is a political animal. All policy decisions are going to be made politically, or at least within a political framework. It's the way it is. And the question is, what is the political outcome you want? He wants one political outcome. I want a different political outcome.
I want to make it so that politics has as little to do with it as possible.
Great question. You got them going again. Thank you so much. Next question?
It's easy to get us going.
Oh.
That's not the problem.
That's true.
This is probably a pretty quick question. You had talked about earlier...
Stay in front of the mic. I can't hear you otherwise.
You had talked about earlier the conditions for immigration that you would do, family, skilled labor, and humanitarianism. Why skilled labor? Why not any form of labor? Because whatever you bring in, it's going to replace. Someone's going to be displaced.
Sure. Yeah, and it's a good question. Why should we let in
Speaking as a college student that will be a skilled labor,
right.
I don't want to be replaced either, so...
I understand. And that's a legitimate question. Why let in anybody based on skills or education? And again, my answer is we should do what I call zero-based budgeting in immigration. We should assume we shouldn't let any immigrants let in based on their skills or education, but make an exception for the exceptional cases. I made a kind of half tongue-in-cheek suggestion in my book as one way of doing that would be just to give people an IQ test, and if you score 140, then you get to come in. The point is a tiny number of people who are clearly extraordinary in their fields, who have the potential to result individually in an enormous increase in the productive capacity of the United States. That's not going to be that many people. I'm willing to take the risk. But, if people insist on not having any skilled immigration, I don't know, I guess I could live with that. It's not my ideal, but we're not. The point is, that's not the issue. The issue is, how do we raise the bar high enough so that we're not just importing ordinary computer programmers who are then employed by the Walt Disney Company firing their American workers, requiring their American workers to train their replacements, and then throwing away their American workers. That's the issue, not whether Albert Einstein would get a green card.
So haven't we also shown, though, that the percentage of that happening is very small? The effect, the impact of that,
Is it
of
realistic?
replacing jobs at that level? And as far as letting only the obvious high IQ, high skilled people in, I think you might be missing out on some valuable resources in people who haven't been discovered yet.
It's possible. We can always, I mean, essentially, immigration's kind of a crapshoot. You don't know what you're going to, well, it's like Forrest Gump. It's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get until you bite into it, of course.
Right.
But, you know, the flip side of that is Sirhan, or, you know, bad guys you don't want either.
Right.
So, you know, you do the best you can, and you minimize the chances of failure, and hope it works out. So, yeah, of course, we could be losing out on somebody who ends up being fantastic. We could also lose out on somebody who ends up detonating a suitcase nuke in Tucson.
Which is kind
and
of my
neither
point.
one of those is, something we can really totally control.
Right, so
Alex, you have a
why
response?
should we limit it?
Alex, do you have a response to limitations on immigration?
The one area where the economic benefits to immigration are the highest are with skilled workers who are coming in. I mean, there's a reason why people on the other side always focus on anecdotes. It's because almost all of the big level research and data taking a look at the wage effects of high-skilled workers, people with master's degrees or even college degrees, is positive on wages, positive on total factor productivity. Just imagine, would the U.S. be a wealthier country with, say, 10% fewer people who are engineers or some other number? Now, maybe some Americans would have stepped up and done some of those, some of that degree, but a lot of them are, and a lot of them end up managing those foreign engineers who come in. That's what we see. It's called skill upgrading. So, there you go.
Thank you.
Sake, 40% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children.
Sorry, Jonathan.
According to
See,
Forbes.
I-
According to Forbes.
That's a
He'll have
made-up
his-
number. They
okay.
count 6, 10 people as founders, and they
Thank you.
count somebody whose grandmother was.
I didn't
around.
make it up, then
Yeah.
Forbes made it up.
I know.
but-
Forbes made it up.
Sure. Next question.
So this is for both of you. What is your opinions on a proposal such as NAFTA, but for labor?
Say it again, like free movement of labor between.
Yes, without
between
requiring
just a particular
citizenship or requiring any of the green cards or work authorization or whatnot, something very similar to what the EU has.
I'm generally against it, but most against it when you're talking about countries at different levels of economic development. With regard to Canada, it would be much less of an issue. And in fact, with regard to Canada, we don't actually have exactly that, but we have a kind of de facto free movement now. With regard to Mexico, no, it would be a mistake now, because Mexico is, in fact, NAFTA, which I'm not really against, NAFTA needed to be paired with very strict immigration controls, precisely because the point of NAFTA really ultimately was to get all the extra farmers off the land in Mexico, rationalize farming, and get those people to move to the city and move into modern jobs. That's what economic development has always done. That was the point. With weak immigration enforcement, a very large share of their rural male population, instead of moving to their own cities, moved to our cities. And that really is kind of the core of the reason we're having this debate now. We needed to have NAFTA for goods, ideas, capital, but strict immigration enforcement for people, because people and things are different. And trade should be a substitute for immigration, because we don't need to import the people anymore to get the benefit of their labor. We can just buy the stuff that they're making.
I think it's a great idea, either bilateral or multilateral agreements such as these to allow at least some workers to go back and forth. It's a great idea. Lots of countries have them around the world for different nations, different skill levels, everything like that. Free trade, we know, economists have studied this for a long time. It's the closest to doctrine that you can get, is that free trade is positive for an economy. Trade accounts for a small percentage of GDP, though. Allowing capital, goods, and services and ideas to move is good. but the benefits for people moving are also good on the host country and on the workers themselves, and in terms of increasing the size of GDP. We know that from a lot of experience. We have a lot of data on that. It's not really that controversial. So I think a thing like that, a bilateral agreement, a multilateral agreement, is great. And I want to also point out that one of the largest free movement zones in the world is the agreement between all the different American states to form a union and allow free immigration.
Let me just
between their different states. So the wage differences between Louisiana and New York are pretty big. Not as big as different countries are in the United States, but pretty high. And we all know that it's better to allow workers to move between different states because it helps economic growth everywhere. The same logic applies to movement between countries, even if the countries are very similar, like the Canada and the United States.
Quick rebuttal.
Let me only quote Henry Simons, one of the fathers of free market economics at the University of Chicago, who wrote, quote, "To insist that a free trade program is logically or practically incomplete without free migration is either disingenuous or stupid. Free trade may and should raise living standards everywhere. Free immigration would level standards, perhaps without raising them anywhere."
Simons didn't work on immigration, as you can tell.
This gentleman has been waiting patiently. Your question?
My question is for you here, Mark. I think you kind of take a moral approach on why we should limit immigration because it would harm American citizens. What do you have to say about what the U.S. has done with our war on drugs and the damage that is done to Mexico? Why don't we have a moral obligation to help them out?
Assuming we have an obligation in that respect, and I'm not going to commit to it one way or the other, I'd have to think about that, we might. What does immigration have to do with it? In other words, letting more people immigrate here from Mexico as a price for our prohibiting various drugs just doesn't strike me as a connection. I mean, if we owe Mexico something along your lines, immigration isn't necessarily what we would owe them. As a sideline, I'm probably not as in favor of legalizing drugs as Alex is, but I mean, I think I agree that our war on drugs has gone too far, and we should start dialing back on it. But the idea that more Mexicans should be allowed to move here because we ban the use of methamphetamines just doesn't connect.
Like, what I'm suggesting here is that we have damaged Mexico's economy through the war on drugs, and just you've been taking a moral position that Americans deserve, I guess, the economic opportunities we have. Like, why doesn't that work both ways?
Number one, American government policy has to be based on what's good for Americans, and so we have an obligation to our fellow citizens that's different and greater than we have to foreigners, number one. Number two, even along your scenario, I don't know what the sort of remedy would be, but there's no reason it should be moving to the United States and abandoning their own country. How is that fixing Mexico?
Quick response.
Very briefly, I think, all drugs should be legalized, and the harm of American drug policy is catastrophic, regardless of anything to do with immigration. But the failure of the war on drugs is also the failure of government policies to try to enforce rules that go counter to the laws of economics, just like immigration restrictions.
We do have one person, and so it looks like this will be our last question, if you don't mind stepping up and asking it.
Okay.
Is this for Mark, too?
I had a question for Mark and then a question for both.
Okay.
If that's allowed.
Let's do one. Let's do the one for both.
For both? Okay.
So we can both get a response.
Okay. Is there a connection between U.S. foreign interventions for U.S. interests on immigration policy, and should they be addressed together or separately?
Clearly there's a connection where a lot of U.S. troops have been at different wars in the past, like as an occupying force in the Philippines or in Korea or in Western Europe at different time periods. There's been a surge of immigration after that point. Same with like Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam now. There's definitely a connection with that. That seems to be part and parcel. When a lot of Americans go overseas to a different place for whatever reason, they seem to make a lot of connections with people in whatever capacity, and that seems to stimulate flows to this country and going forward.
Yeah, immigration takes place through networks. Nobody wakes up in Uruguay and says, today I'm going to move to Oshkosh. People go where they have friends, where they have relatives, where they have some kind of connection or reason to go, and our various misadventures abroad help create some of those networks. There are other ways those networks are created, but yes, this is one of the important ways. It's a imperial backwash, basically. It's the reason there's a lot of Algerians in France and not a lot of, Bolivians. It's the reason there's a lot of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis in England and not a lot of, say, Thais. This is the reason, the reason we have Filipino immigration is because we ruled the Philippines for 50 years. Same with, as Alex said, with Vietnam, Korea, Puerto Rico is the example of that. We actually took the place over, and now a quarter of all Puerto Ricans live here, and it's rising. So yeah, and now this is, it's not an immigration issue, strictly speaking, but personally, just as a citizen, yeah, I think we're way too eager to stick our nose in other people's businesses. And that does, in fact, create real immigration backwash, and that's one of the reasons I want to stop sticking our nose in other people's business.
Okay, well, I think at this point we're going to wrap up everything. I hope everyone signed in and got their extra credit. We want to thank Mark and Alex again for taking time to be here today to discuss immigration. And I want to thank the university for hosting this debate, and thank you to everyone who attended and asked questions. Have a great day, everybody.